I'm the president of the Jamestown Foundation, and we very much would like to thank you for coming to attend our 13th Annual Terrorism Conference. It's hard to believe, but we've been doing this for the past 13 years, and we started as far back as December 2006 with our very first annual terrorism conference. At that time, it was called the Al-Qaeda Triangle. So we've certainly seen a lot of changes in the world since 2006. And we're all just happy here that you're in attendance at our event and that you'll be participating. You have to be very much assured that with Jamestown Foundation, which publishes a terrorism monitor, our interest in terrorism is not ending, and we'll continue to keep our eye on the ball, and we'll continue to assess the world of terrorism and its actors. In today's world of terrorism, it certainly involves state actors, sub-state actors, and non-state actors. It certainly is no less complicated than it was when we started assessing terrorism and holding our first conference in December 2006. Many in Washington may now get the sense that the U.S. has finished off its efforts against ISIS and Al-Qaeda because they are defeated and because we've eliminated terrorism threats posed by Abu Bakr Baghdadi and Osama bin Laden. Leaders may die, but the ideology of militant movements does continue and does remain on the internet. It is tempting, therefore, for many in the United States to declare victory accomplished and call for the U.S. to pack up and go home and focus on deterring China and reindustrialize the United States. These are important questions to the United States after spending from $2 to $3 trillion in Afghanistan, but it does not answer the question, though, about how we will deal with the future terrorism threats posed by the magnitude of a future Al-Qaeda or ISIS 2.0. That is one of the questions of this conference and what we hope to address today. As people like Ayman Zawahiri still remain at large, there still is a potential danger of another 9/11. We don't know where the future of Iraq is going. It's certainly, there's light at the end of the tunnel, but it's a country that just defeated ISIS is now facing a major, huge domestic instability. Given that terrorism operates in cycles, we definitely need to be answering this question. The lessons of history tell us that terrorism groups often spend years rebuilding and consolidating after major defeats. While sub-state actors and proxies of the U.S. like the YPG remain important, so do U.S. allies like Turkey, which has the second largest army in NATO. Turkey's intervention in Syria, we need to take note that, yes, nation-states like the enemy get a vote and act to defend what is in their national interest, which can, unfortunately, complicate U.S. counterterrorism goals and objectives in a country like Syria. Therefore, we at Jamestown always strive to use our terrorism conference to look at all these issues and look at the future year ahead and what may happen in the next 12 months. Today, we plan to give you multiple perspectives. In the first panel, moderated by Claudia Rosett, we will take the larger strategic perspective of terrorism flying at 30,000 feet. We'll offer you the insights by prominent terrorism expert and Jamestown board member Bruce Hoffman, followed by senior practitioners of U.S. counterterrorism policy, Mike Vickers, who is also a board member of Jamestown and former director of intelligence at the Pentagon, and Michael Doran, who is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and they will assess the impact of the defeat of ISIS and what it means for U.S. CT policy and for our allies in the Middle East. Another goal of today's event is to examine the future impact of a post-U.S. Afghanistan and what it means for U.S. CT policy by examining U.S. efforts to sign an agreement with the Taliban that will offer presentations on the various regional perspectives on the impact of a future withdrawal. You don't have to look any further than the pages of the Washington Post this week and its disclosures about the U.S. effort in Afghanistan to know that it is certainly the looming strategic issue for the next year. We're delighted that Seth Jones is with us, formerly of RAND, now at CSIS, Abu Bakr Siddiqui, who is the author of a major book on the Pashtuns. Hassan Abbas is coming, and his panel will be moderated by Marvin Weinbaum. And from all the way from India, we have Sudha Ramachandran, who will be speaking to share India's perspective on the post-U.S. Afghanistan. So for the rest of the day, we will be featuring the panels on the Middle East and Africa and current CT developments. We'll provide you with a sense of what state actors like Russia are up to in the Middle East and Africa through Sergei Sukhankin, who will be here speaking. Many of you have been following the Kremlin's and Russia's activities using their proxy Wagner in Africa, and you've recently seen them inside of Syria. And in regard to Africa, we have a wonderful panel that will be discussing various aspects of Africa. Brian Perkins, the editor of our Terrorism Monitor publication, is here. Brian, please raise your hand right there. If you want to write an article for Jamestown, talk to him. Brian just came back from South Africa, where he's been attending a conference on terrorism trends in East Africa. So his insights are fresh and from the region. And we'll be offering you many different developments. We have Senior Fellow Michael Ryan, who's also speaking here today. So we'll be beginning with Jacob Zen, who will also be speaking, our predominant expert on the Sahel. So we also will be featuring Dario Cristiani, who will be giving you the Italian perspective on North Africa, who certainly offers insights on Italian views of Africa, but also Dario is a well-known expert on North Africa. So I want to say, wish you all success today, enjoy the day, and thank you for your continuing support of Jamestown. The event will be videotaped, it will be online within days of the conference. And also, most importantly, my staff reminds me, if you're following Twitter, look for the hashtag Jamestown Terrorism Conference. So please tweet us if it's possible. And Claudia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome to the first panel. You have the biography, so just a very quick introduction. We have over on the far end of the table Bruce Hoffman, who is professor at Georgetown Walsh School of Foreign Service and author of the standard textbook Inside Terrorism, now in its 3rd edition. We have Michael Vickers, key strategist in the 2 great wars of our time, driving the Soviets out of Afghanistan and hunting bin Laden, and author of the new book, By All Means Necessary. And Michael Doran, senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, author of Ike's Gamble, most recently on Eisenhower's strategic view of the thinking on the Middle East. And we're going to have about 16 minutes of remarks by each panelist, and then I will ask a brief question, and we'll open up the floor to questions. Thank you very much. Bruce, if you'd like to begin.
Thank you, Claudia. Thanks, Glenn, for inviting me to speak again at the Jamestown Foundation's annual terrorism conference. I think I've made all but 2 of them of the past 13, and it's always an extremely important event. Not least now, when terrorism is somewhat fallen from the radar screen, and we're sort of flush with the triumph of having killed Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and destroyed the caliphate. If you've been reading the newspaper this week, the Washington Post in particular, it has revealed our long and increasingly lamentable involvement in Afghanistan, and it's sort of taken us on a journey back in time with our frustrations in the war on terrorism. I also wanted to, before I get into the main part of my presentation, to visit the Department of Wishful Thinking when it comes to terrorism, and recall, at least in the context of Afghanistan, just to show how hard it is to defeat terrorist adversaries, recall an interview that was on, which shows you how long ago it was. It was on the Larry King Show on CNN, when Larry King interviewed the then Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, and asked him, what is the current situation in Afghanistan in December 2002? And Secretary Rumsfeld replied, it is encouraging. They have elected a government through the Loya Jirga process. The Taliban are gone. The Al-Qaeda are gone. 2 years later, at a campaign stop in Ohio, President Bush declared that the Taliban is no longer in existence. And if anything, we know that the Taliban is unfortunately still a thriving enterprise. Certainly, Al-Qaeda's obituary has been written countless times over the past 15 or 16 years. And just to underscore that, over-exaggerating the ease with which it is to eliminate terrorist organizations, we just have to recall President Obama's famous depiction of ISIS in his interview in January 2014 with the New Yorker, when he described it as the JV team of terrorism. And I say all this only because it underscores how enormously challenging it is to defeat a terrorist organization and to eliminate its threat. And certainly the killing of Baghdadi and the defeat of the caliphate is an enormously important step forward, but unfortunately it's not the end of this struggle, much as we may wish that were the case. So firstly, let me briefly comment on what we know about ISIS today, its resiliency and the threat that it poses. Let me then very briefly talk about ISIS's new leader, and then offer some speculation about what the long-term repercussions of recent events affecting ISIS might be. Well, I think very clearly, last April's Easter Sunday attacks in Sri Lanka demonstrates that ISIS still has enormous resonance and that its brand is still appealing to disenfranchised and violent individuals and groups in various corners of the world. And Sri Lanka was perhaps the least expected venue for an ISIS attack. And here I think we have to be mindful of the fact that ISIS was able to leverage two hitherto completely obscure, in one case totally unknown, local terrorist groups, and at least enable them or empower them to commit what was one of the most lethal terrorist attacks since 9/11. Neither group had any known prior connection with ISIS, according to a report issued by the United Nations last July. Its counterterrorism unit concluded that the attacks were apparently carried out without the knowledge or approval of ISIS's senior leadership in the Levant, which in and of itself is enormously worrying, because what that suggests is that ISIS, in order to ensure its survival and longevity, has devolved power from the center to the periphery. Also, too, I mean, these Easter Sunday attacks, at least I would imagine the planning for them long predated the horrific tragedy that occurred in March in Christchurch, New Zealand, when a gunman attacked two mosques in that city and killed over 50 persons, although ISIS claimed responsibility for the Sri Lanka attacks as revenge for the New Zealand shootings. You can't put together a terrorist operation that involves 6 simultaneous bombings and 5 bombs that actually explode. I mean, improvised explosive devices are still in the realm, even in skilled terrorist hands, of more art than in some cases science. And what was worrisome is that even the 6th bomber, whose bomb malfunctioned, didn't give up. I mean, he was so implacably committed to going ahead and fulfilling the operation that he went back to the boarding house that he was hiding out in, tried to reassemble the bomb and rearm it, and then inadvertently blew himself up. I think a key dimension of the attacks, and there's still a lot that is not known about them in great detail, at least amongst unclassified sources. But I think a key dimension of the attack was the terrorist cell's ability to harness the experiences and expertise of at least one of its members, someone named Jamil Mohammed Abdul Latif. He was a Sri Lankan national who in 2014 had left his homeland and traveled to Raqqa, where he joined ISIS and became one of the fabled foreign fighters. And I don't think his survival and escape from Syria is by any means typical. Only about 10,000 of the total of approximately 40,000 foreign fighters who came to fight with ISIS in the Levant and Iraq, in fact, were killed, at least according to the research of my former colleague from RAND, an old friend, Dr. Rebecca Kim Cragen at the National Defense University, whose I think figures for my money are about the best and most accurate. At least 15,000 of that number were reportedly able to flee the caliphate before its collapse. Of that number, approximately 7,500 returned to their adopted or native homelands, of whom only about half are imprisoned or are actively being monitored. Another 5,000 were deported by Turkey to other countries, often without those countries being informed that they were receiving foreign fighters. And almost in all cases of the origins of those foreign fighters, those countries and governments being informed that their citizens were being, or permanent residents were being deported elsewhere. 2,500 other foreign fighters found sanctuary in the Sudan. About 3,000 others migrated to ISIS branches elsewhere. And about 8,000 or so are still fighting, waging a Maoist-level insurgency both in Syria and in Iraq. Accordingly, today, despite the killing of ISIS's founder and leader, despite the elimination of the Islamic State, or at least of its caliphate, ISIS is still able to prosecute robust insurgencies in Syria and Iraq, in Nigeria, in Afghanistan, the Sinai, and the Philippines. It has constant but a somewhat more limited presence today in Yemen, Libya, the Caucasus, and the Sahel, amongst other places. And what's most worrisome is over the past 2 or 3 years, as the caliphate was in the process of being dismantled by the unprecedented 79-nation coalition arrayed against it, so as the center was shrinking and being destroyed, ISIS was also spreading. And this is not just my opinion. If you look at the very important U.S. National Counterterrorism Strategy that was released about 15 months ago at the end of September, the beginning of October 2018, it makes exactly this point, that as the caliphate was being destroyed and the Islamic State was being defeated, ISIS was nonetheless spreading. The report last year depicted a movement that had 8 official branches and about 24 networks. I dare say that's probably grown in the past year, because we know that ISIS in recent months has gained affiliates in Congo, Mozambique, Kashmir, and Avaz, the Sunni Arab area of Iran. So this, I think, speaks to the resiliency and continued appeal of ISIS. There's another thing that I find very worrisome about ISIS, as like all terrorist organizations, they're the archetypal sharks in the water if they're going to survive, which means they have to adapt and adjust even to the most consequential countermeasures directed against them, change course and find new ways to frustrate law enforcement, intelligence, and military initiatives against them. A key element that we are increasingly seeing with ISIS in this, whatever it's the 2.0 or 3.0 generation, is the involvement of family members in its operations. For example, 2 brothers who were the sons of one of the wealthiest persons in Sri Lanka, a spice merchant, were among the 6 Easter Sunday bombers. 4 sets of brothers comprised the 10-person terrorist cell that was unmasked in Catalonia, Spain in August 2017 and was responsible for the attacks on Las Ramblas in Barcelona and in Cambrils. 2 brothers participated in the November 2015 Paris attacks, and 2 in the dual suicide bombings in Brussels the following March. Now, admittedly, siblings have long been involved in terrorism and also in al-Qaeda attacks. In fact, 2 brothers were among the 19 hijackers on September 11th. But critically, in recent years, ISIS has turned terrorism into a family affair. For example, husband and wife were responsible for the tragic mass shooting in San Bernardino, California 4 years ago. 3 brothers were implicated in a plot to blow up an Etihad Airways passenger flight en route from Sydney to Abu Dhabi in July 2017. And 3 sets of families were implicated in May 2018 in suicide bombings that occurred in Surabaya, Indonesia, that country's 2nd largest city. Among them, which was completely typical of the other 2 families, was a family of 6, including a 9-year-old daughter and her 3 brothers, ages 18, 16, and 12. So when one imagines the difficulty of penetrating existent terrorist cells composed of like-minded conspirators and individuals, it's exponentially more difficult when it's family members who obviously can travel without suspicion, who can conspire without attracting attention to themselves and represent a new and different kind of threat. Very briefly, let me talk about the new leader of ISIS. I mean, this shows us, I think, how poorly we often understand the group, because when the new leader was first announced, there was some confusion over who it was, whether it was someone named Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurashi, or whether it was someone named Abdullah Kardash, also known as Haji Abdullah. Turned out they were one and the same person, in fact. This individual is a former Ba'athist, Iraqi Ba'athist, a secularist that is, served in the Iraqi army, joined al-Qaeda in the early 2000s, where he, I mean, this really says something, where he obtained a reputation within al-Qaeda as a quote-unquote ruthless tyrant, which I imagine is a title that is not at all uncommon in that organization. He's variously been known, which I think speaks to both his intelligence and his ruthlessness, as either the professor or as the destroyer. He was born in 1976 in Tal Afar. From a very religious background, his father was imam of the Al-Furqan Mosque in Mosul. He studied Islamic history at a religious college there. And his credentials and his selection, doubtless, as the new emir of ISIS is because he can claim familial lineage and a direct descendant of the Prophet. He had senior positions in al-Qaeda, when it was al-Qaeda in Iraq, as the director of its fatwa and Sharia sections, so clearly someone who's very immersed at linking theory and practice, as it were, ideology to operations. While in ISIS, he was the Minister of IEDs, which is probably as unique a title as you will find in a terrorist organization, and in that role was responsible or in charge of all of ISIS's bombing and suicide attacks. So he is a very hardened, knowledgeable, experienced terrorist. He did a long period in Camp Bucca, in the prison there, where he was captured in 2003. And I think that his background clearly as an ambidextrous terrorist, but also as a survivor, means that he is well positioned in the movement to perhaps affect what would be our worst nightmare, which would be some reunification or amalgamation or at least strategic cooperation with al-Qaeda. I mean, don't forget, he began his career in al-Qaeda itself. Al-Qaeda and ISIS's ideology are one and the same. Where they have always differed, it's in the question of timing and perhaps in tone and style, not in substance or ideology. And al-Qaeda has been, at least in my estimation, positioning itself, particularly in Idlib province, to take advantage precisely of the vacuum that has been created by the collapse of the caliphate and by the defeat, at least, of the Islamic State. In that vacuum, someone like al-Qaradash could see tremendous advantage to at least some form of cooperation with al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has always coveted ISIS's dexterity and facility with social media. Also, I would argue ISIS's still existent external operations capability. So for a leader of a group who himself is a proven survivor, who is intent on keeping at least the flame of this revolution or this struggle alive, in the future, some strategic cooperation or even reunification with al-Qaeda is certainly not out of the question. Since 2014 and ISIS's expulsion from the al-Qaeda fold, there have been intermittent, sporadic efforts to reunify both groups, and perhaps in the near future, the time will be much more propitious for such an arrangement. So let me stop there.
Thank you for a vivid, brilliant, and chilling presentation. Michael Vickers, please.
Okay. So I was asked to say a few words on what the future of U.S. counterterrorism policy will be after the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. We are less, and so let me give you the bottom line up front. I can't tell you what the future of U.S. CT policy will be. We're less than a year away from a U.S. presidential election, and significant departures in CT policy are certainly possible depending on who wins. President Trump, to put it delicately, is nothing if not unpredictable, and he may be prone to abrupt changes in the year ahead. What I can tell you is what U.S. counterterrorism policy should be, and the answer to that is pretty much the same as it was before the death of al-Baghdadi, based on what's been proven to work over the past 2 decades and the continued threat, as Bruce has so eloquently described, from global jihadists. U.S. CT policy must continue to deny global jihadist organizations any sanctuary as we pursue their operational and strategic defeat, and do what is necessary to prevent another 9/11 scale attack. Let me briefly elaborate on what's worked and what hasn't in CT policy, why we're almost certainly facing a very long war with the global jihadists, and where we should go from here. So first, what's worked and what hasn't. 5 things have worked really well in U.S. CT strategy. The first obvious one is hardening our defenses. Basically, the first big step was bolting cockpit doors after 9/11 on aircraft. But we've had to evolve with the threat to deal with liquid explosives and explosives that are difficult to detect by current scanners, and that evolution, that action-reaction continues, but hardening defenses remains a critical component of strategy. The second is this is a war you cannot fight without a global network of partners. I call it the Global Counterterrorism Network, and it's a tremendous U.S. asset. Causing holes or putting strains on various aspects of that partner network really weakens our overall CT strategy, as most plots are disrupted by sharing intelligence with partners and then disrupting them in an early stage. there are things the U.S. must do unilaterally. We collect a lot of intelligence from our partners, but we also do a lot unilaterally, and counterterrorism operations are inherently intelligence-driven, as was the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And then on the lethal side, intense, sustained, precision armed reconnaissance campaigns with the Predator unmanned aerial system as our principal weapon has been an enormous asset in the war against the global jihadists, allowing us to reach into areas we can't reach with any other element of our forces. And then finally, when appropriate, back to working with partners, fully enabling advise and assist operations. We did it right after 9/11 to kick the Taliban temporarily out of Afghanistan and al-Qaeda. And then we did it more recently to destroy the ISIS caliphate with the Syrian Defense Forces. So to sum up, our war with the global jihadists is fundamentally an intelligence and special operations war, and it's a war that depends on a network of global partners if we are to win it eventually. We must remain on the offense if we are to prevent another 9/11. So what hasn't worked over the past 2 decades? And even before our 9/11 attacks. Well, first is containment, or as some scholars call it, offshore balancing. They're balancing really nothing. Over-reliance on partners who aren't ready. We've had cases in Iraq and Yemen where partners that we had invested a lot in have suddenly collapsed in the face of attack. And then reliance on really dubious partners like the Russians in Syria, or even Iran, indirectly, Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah in Syria. Large-scale nation-building efforts and attempts at regional transformation to transform one country and then hope that it catalyzes and transforms the region, kind of the opposite of what global jihadists are trying to do, hasn't worked as well. And then CT strategies in isolation, what I call strategic myopia, specifically in Yemen and Syria, where in Yemen, after Arab Spring, we were very, very focused on al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and not so much the Houthi threat. And as a result, we lost our counterterrorism partner, the Hadi government, as a result, and our CT strategy became less effective. And then the same in Syria for a variety of reasons, trying to focus just on CT and not the larger regional context of Syria has led to potentially down the road less effective CT strategies. So let me elaborate on what Bruce said for a second on why this will be a very long war. The first is that the campaigns in a conventional war, if you're successful, campaigns accumulate. You know, you do the Battle of the Atlantic, you then do D-Day and the invasion of Europe, you go to Berlin, you capture the capital, and each campaign builds on itself. In an unconventional counterterrorism campaign, it's far more nonlinear, and you have these momentum shifts, and we have indeed in this war. Before 9/11, and obviously al-Qaeda had the strategic advantage, then we did for a few years. In 2003, it shifted as we went to the war in Iraq. Al-Qaeda built up a new sanctuary in Pakistan, or the Afghan-Pakistan border region. Taliban reconstituted as well. Pakistanis executed a peace agreement with al-Qaeda that basically, or with militants in the tribal regions, which basically let al-Qaeda have free reign, and the threat went way up. 2008, President Bush made a very bold decision to take the fight to al-Qaeda, started pounding the heck out of them in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region, and from 2008 to 2011, the U.S. had the advantage, kind of culminating with the death of bin Laden and probably extending into the death of Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, and then a series of strikes against al-Qaeda's global presence. That shifted in 2013. I would say from 2013 to 2016, the jihadists had the advantage again. You saw ISIS reconstitute, take over large parts of Syria and Iraq, etc. And then since 2016, the U.S. and its partners have had the advantage again, destroying the caliphate, and then the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. 7 factors favor protracted conflict. 1, insurgencies, as Bruce talked about, are hard to defeat, and terrorist groups are particularly hard to defeat if you look at them over time. And this is a global insurgency of global jihadists because they've spread in a lot of areas. And so factors of time and space play into it, and it just will take a lot of time to root them out. And then any religious war tends to be very long, and this one is motivated by ideology, and so even if you compress the group down to low levels, they don't necessarily give up. It's very cost effective for the jihadists, doesn't take a lot of money to sustain operations. They do have certain allies that provide them active and passive sanctuary, still groups in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region and elsewhere. You have the instability in the large ungoverned spaces in the Middle East and sectarian conflict that, much as it helped ISIS reform, will help 2.0, 3.0, whatever it is. They're very clever in taking advantages of advances in technology, social media, and commercial encryption, which makes them easier to spread their ideology and harder to target. And then the U.S. is now focused on great power challenges. While it's not ignoring terrorism, it's a little lower on the national security priorities list. So let me conclude by talking about where we go from here. So it's very popular these days in American political circles to talk about forever wars and how bad they are and how they must be ended, and perhaps certain wars should be ended. But the global fight, or fight with global jihadists, is not a war that America can safely withdraw from. Rather than a forever war, it should be described as a never-again war, the principal goal of which is to prevent another 9/11 attack. And that's, for all our problems since 9/11, that's something we have done. It's more akin, in my mind, to strategic deterrence. We maintain a robust nuclear arsenal. We hope we never have to use it. But it's something we maintain to prevent that kind of war than it is to large-scale counterinsurgency and nation building. Presidents Bush, Obama, and Trump have had significant successes in counterterrorism policy, but at times have either took their eyes off the ball or undermined that policy in various ways. And I certainly hope that that becomes less in the rest of this administration and future administrations. We must stay the course and maintain our intel and CT presence in the 4 principal theaters that we face right now: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Syria, Iraq, and then North Africa, centered on Libya and the Sahel, and then the global threat that these groups inspire elsewhere. We must not unilaterally dismantle our global CT network, and we must ground our strategy in the Middle East as it is, not as we might wish it to be. And then finally, we must deal with the evolving threat as it moves to more inspired attacks, as it has over the past few years. Domestic intelligence and security becomes far more important. And with that, I'll conclude.
Thank you for a spectacular overview. Michael Doran.
Thanks. That was beautiful. Because my talk is going to be an elaboration of the second to last sentence that Mike said, which was we have to ground our strategy in the Middle East as it actually is, rather than as we want it to be. The title of my talk is U.S. Counterterrorism Policy in Syria and Turkey's Regional Role. And what I want to argue is that Turkey has been a victim of strategic, what Bruce just called strategic myopia. I want to submit to you that since 9/11, we have increasingly substituted counterterrorism strategy for American geostrategy in the Middle East. And as a result of that, that is the reason why that is the major reason why our relations with Turkey are in the crisis that they are in. We forgot after 9/11 Clausewitz's dictum that war is the continuation of politics by other means. And we stopped thinking about the regional order that we need to build in order to have an the most effective counterterrorism strategy possible, and just defaulted all the time to these fantastic tools that we have developed. And they are absolutely fantastic, and we will have to rely on them, as Bruce said. Let me start, before I even get to Turkey or to Syria, let me just start with a recent quote from Secretary of Defense Espers about Iraq. And now, before I read you this quote, let's stop for a second and think about what's going on in Iraq today. Over the last few weeks, we have seen a widespread uprising in Shiite areas of Iraq, but not only, against the corruption of the central government and the domination of the central government by Iran, and the use of Iran's proxies to suppress the population in the South. People are rising up, explicitly anti-Iranian, explicitly hostile to the proxies of Iran in Iraq, and they're being shot down in the street by those proxies and by Iraqi security forces. And Secretary of Defense said, in Iraq, we continue to work by, with, and through the Iraqi security forces to enable a strong and independent state. I was recently there to visit our troops and met with our Iraqi partners. Despite the turmoil at the political level, our train, advise, and assist efforts with the Iraqi military remain strong and continue to show progress. This is, I think, as good a snapshot as you can get of what American strategy in the Middle East over the last two administrations, or two and a half administrations, has produced. That is to say, think about it this way. Think about this operation that we conducted against Baghdadi recently. There are very few countries in the world that can carry out an operation like that. You can go into a hostile area, go take out your target. Not a single American soldier is lost. We did the same thing against bin Laden. This incredible counterterrorism skill. The United States can do that. The Israelis, perhaps the British. I doubt the Russians could even do it. This is amazing, and we have shown time and time again that we can do this. And as we have developed this tool and as we have used it more and more, we have seen a massive proliferation of Iranian-backed militias across the region, and now the distribution to those militias of precision strike weapons, which they used recently in Saudi Arabia. Now that's a terrorism threat, and that is a strategic threat simultaneously, and we don't have a good answer to it. Why? Because unlike in our fight against ISIS or Al Qaeda, we're actually deterred against going against Iran. If we go against Iran's proxies, we're afraid that Iran will take that war to Saudi Arabia and take down Saudi Arabia. So we are deterred. Now, what we need in that fight is a vision of a regional order that will contain Iran, and we need partners for that. There are only three potential major partners in the Middle East for the United States. If the United States is not going to do it all unilaterally, and we now know we're not, those three partners are Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Turkey. Those are the major partners who can project power beyond their borders. They're not perfect partners, so I don't have the time here to go into it. You can probably all explain to yourself why they are not. Let me talk to you about what we did with our potential partner, Turkey, because it's a story that is not well known. There's now a list. If you read any newspaper article about Turkey, you read a list of all the sins, real and sometimes imagined, of Erdogan, but never a clear story as told from the Turkish point of view, not just from Erdogan's point of view, the Turkish point of view, of why Turkey is so angry with the United States. And when I say Turkey, it is Turkey. If you go and you visit, you talk to even people who are hostile to Erdogan are extremely angry at the CT policy that the United States has carried out in Syria. The roots of the conflict, of the crisis in U.S.-Turkish relations, today. The direct roots go back, not all the way back to 2003 and not to 2010. They begin with the Russian-Iranian escalation after the signing or after the completion of the JCPOA in July 2015. In September 2015, the Russians and the Iranians engaged in a massive escalation in Syria, which the Obama administration decided to turn a blind eye to. But if you actually look at what they did on the ground, it's much worse than that. They actually sided passively, tacitly, with the Russians and the Iranians. I think Mike was, I don't want to put words in Mike's mouth, but I think he was alluding to this when he said that we have been enticed by dubious partners such as the Russians and the Iranians. The United States recognized tacitly Syria as a Russian and Iranian sphere of interest in September 2015. And it began to carry out policies designed to shut down Turkish support for the opposition to the Assad government. So at the same moment that the Russians and the Iranians were beginning their escalation, and they began to the siege of Aleppo, which was the strategic prize in the fight against Assad, the U.S., in the name of fighting ISIS, demanded that the Turks shut down their border, the Syrian-Turkish border, which was the route through which any support for Aleppo was going. Now, in addition, this is the part that I think really is seared into Turkish consciousness. The Russians and the Iranians allied with the YPG. That is, the YPG is the Syrian arm of the PKK. These are the separatist Kurdish movement that is the sworn enemy of every patriotic Turk and of Turkey. They want to create an independent Kurdish. They want to have an independent Kurdistan that will break away from Turkey, and they have positions of strength in Syria, and they are traditionally the allies of the Russians, Iranians, and the Syrians. And in fact, the YPG, also a fact not well understood in the United States, was created in consultation between the Assad government, the Iranian government, and the PKK. When the Assad government realized that it was not going to be able to hold the east of Syria. So as the power of the Assad government contracted, the Assad government had a simple question to ask. Who's going to take over in the east? Turkey or some coalition that's friendly to us? And the solution they came to was PKK in coordination with the Iranians. And so in September 2015, when the Russians and the Iranians began to advance on Aleppo, they partnered with the YPG out of Afrin. That's another point of another Kurdish area in the northwest, where the PKK had a stronghold, and the PKK helped the Russians and the Iranians to encircle Aleppo and cut off all the support from the Turks. Now, at the same time that the Russians and the Iranians were using the PKK in the northwest of the country, the United States created the SDF, that's the Syrian Democratic Forces, the heart of which is the YPG, that is the PKK. We rebranded it purposefully as not the YPG because we understood that there was a problem with us using Kurdish separatists on the Turkish border at the same time that the Russians and Iranians were using the same group. So if you look at it from the point of view of Ankara, the United States was using the YPG in the, we moved them, for example, into Manbij, west of the Euphrates, in an area where we promised the Turks we would never do it. So you have the United States using the YPG in the east, and the Russians and the Iranians using the YPG in the west to create the basis for an independent PKK statelet right on Turkey's border. If you're sitting in Ankara and you're looking at this, the only thing you can conclude is that the United States has effectively, regardless of what language it is using, regardless of how it's explaining it to itself, the United States is working together with the Russians and the Iranians to create a PKK statelet on Turkey's borders. This, of course, made heads explode all across Turkey, and this is the reason for the Operation Euphrates Shield, where the Turkish military went in and created a finger of control in order to split up the U.S.-backed YPG and the Russian and Iranian-backed YPG, and to prevent the creation of a PKK statelet. That's the origins of the problem between the United States and Turkey today. Now, one last point here, which is, why did the United States do this? And this is the connection between the counterterrorism myopia and the lack of a. This is the issue about counterterrorism myopia and a lack of a strategic vision. President Obama thought the most important thing he could do in the Middle East was to come to a strategic accommodation with the Russians and the Iranians. He did not want to get sucked into the Syrian civil war. One, because he didn't want to get sucked into another civil war, but two, because if he got sucked into it, he was going to be working with the Turks against the Russians, against the Iranians, against Assad. It was going to scuttle the JCPOA, which he thought was dependent on good relations with the Russians and the Iranians. And his vision of a kind of concert system in the Middle East that included Russia, Iran, and the United States would be ruined. So instead, he chose to ruin relations with the Turks by aligning with their sworn enemy. The attraction of the PKK, if you talk to anyone in the military, they say, oh, they're great fighters, great fighters, great fighters. Okay, but that was one of the things that was attractive. But the major attraction of the PKK was that it had good relations with the Russians and the Iranians, and it would not suck America into the Civil War and alienate Russia and America. And don't take my word for that now. General Votel, in a recent article in the Atlantic, said we liked the YPG because it would not suck us into the Civil War. General Votel, former commander of U.S. CENTCOM. Now, we have propagandized ourselves into believing that we never did anything like this, that we never made a calculation to go with the Russians and the Iranians against the Turks. We have come up with a list of sins that Erdogan has, some of which are very real, and explained the crisis in U.S.-Turkish relations as a result of his sins. And in doing this, we are blinding ourselves to the realities on the ground in the Middle East. If we want to create an enduring order with partners who will actually work with us on our priorities, then we have to take into consideration the strategic perception of those partners and the strategic priorities of those partners. One of the things that we say time and time again is that Turkey is pro-ISIS. This is nonsense. Turkey made a calculation that every other country in the region made, which is, I want to know what is the new order that is going to replace the order that's going to replace the ISIS order. They did not want a PKK order. That's what they didn't want, and they wanted our assurance that we would help them prevent that from happening. And we not only did we refuse to give them that assurance, we actually worked against them. A strategy that any Turkey specialist could have told you was inevitably going to alienate not just Erdogan, but the Turks. We have to reinforce what Mike said. If we are gonna maintain a position in the Middle East long term with a smaller military footprint, we have to work with partners, major partners, and we have to take into consideration their understanding of their strategic needs. If we don't do that, we're gonna see more of what we've seen, which is we go in, we eliminate terrorists, and in the vacuum that is created is filled by actors that are as bad as the ones we destroyed, or in the case of Iran, I believe, much worse. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a terrific insight into an important piece of all this. I'm just going to ask a brief question of all three, whoever is willing here, and then open up the floor to questions. And I think Michael Doran has just been talking about the way in which terrorism issues connect with large strategic problems. You know, from Turkey, we go on to the question of what happens with NATO. From NATO at this point, we see Russia exercising with China. And over the past, since the 9/11 attacks, we've gone from talking about terrorism as the biggest threat to Iran, to Russia, to right now China. And my question, maybe if I could ask each of you for a very brief comment on this, is to what extent are these enmeshed, these sort of rising great power challenges and this long war that you're talking about? Whoever would like to address that first?
Well, I think the way they're enmeshed is what Mike was talking about, which is, one of the successes of U.S. foreign policy in the early 1970s was to kick the Russians essentially out of the Middle East, or former Soviet Union. And they've been brought back in now. And so what the new order will be, the most conducive order to counterterrorism is to have many, many partners, not just the three major partners that Mike talked about, but lots of partners. You see Turkey, two of the three partners Mike talked about, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, various degrees of estrangement from the United States and closer to Russia. And part of that is policy decisions, I think, that the U.S. government made help create that or foster it. Part of it is bad actions on the part of those partners as well.
Right. I mean, one of the threads connecting them is this perennial sort of shadow war, a low-level conflict. I mean, almost gray area conflict that doesn't rise to actual nation-state conflicts, but rather are struggles carried out, whether by terrorists or by state actors, using these proxies of subversion, information operations, that is false flag operations, and disinformation and influence operations that enables them to achieve strategic goals, but at relatively little cost. And I think this is, one of the biggest challenges we face now is that the nature of warfare, particularly in the Middle East and especially in the Levant, is changing dramatically.
If I tie it back to Turkey, it's if you followed the press recently, when President Trump decided to get out of northeast Syria under pressure from the Turks, there was a theme running through a lot of the commentary that the U.S. was handing that the Trump administration was handing the Syria to the Russians, and that Erdogan is no longer a reliable ally, and Turkey is really a Trojan horse for the Russians. This I think is a very short-sighted analysis that doesn't take into consideration any of the things that I said, that I just explained. Or, for example, remember that in the fall of 2015, the Turks shot down a Russian fighter that was attacking Turkmen opponents of the Assad regime right on the Turkish-Syrian border, inside Syria, but on the Turkish border. The Russian airplane violated Turkish airspace. The Turks shot it down. The United States and NATO defined this as a bilateral Turkish-Russian problem. And they did that at exactly the same moment that the United States was pressing Turkey, as I said, to close off its border and stop supporting the opposition to Assad. Now, if NATO has a strategic purpose, it seems to me that is balancing Russia in Eurasia. That should be the number one issue. And here we had a NATO ally that was at loggerheads with the Russians at a moment when the Russians were probing NATO airspace all along the NATO-Europe frontier from the Baltics down to the Balkans. So this was exactly the moment, and this was exactly the moment to come in behind the Turks on this in an effort to limit the influence of the Russians and the Russians and the Iranians. And we did just the exact opposite. And if you want to understand why the Turks today are entering into major weapons deals with the Russians, that's the starting point right there. We told Erdogan, solve your problems with Russia on your own, not with us. We didn't create a strategic framework in which he could solve those problems.
Thank you all very much for terrific presentation, and we now welcome questions. Yes, sir. If you could please just give us your name and affiliation, and please keep your questions as brief as possible. Thank you.
Michael Ryan from Jamestown. Mike takes the mic. Okay. Michael Ryan from Jamestown. It's a question, starting with Bruce, but anybody who might have it. It's a kind of a technical question. I mean, I was intrigued by the possible melding of some of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the future. Do you have any hard evidence? I have suspicions, but I don't yet have hard evidence of sharing of logistic movements throughout the Middle East by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, that they move people, equipment, men. I mean, they all use smuggling routes. But have you seen any cooperation that we can pinpoint and say it's hard?
No, and that's why I emphasized at the beginning that I was just speculating. I mean, going back to even the months or the weeks following Al-Qaeda's expulsion of ISIS from its fold, there were always efforts meant at, there were always ongoing efforts meant oriented towards some form of reconciliation. In fact, in December 2014, ISIS supporters in Raqqa tried to stage a coup, actually, against al-Baghdadi to facilitate that. So, I mean, my point is that their ideologies are not different, that there are grounds for strategic cooperation. There have been all sorts of reports about Horace al-Din proving much more effective in recent months in uniting fractious jihadi elements in Idlib, including sort of moderating Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's hostility towards al-Qaeda as well, and perhaps making overtures to the surviving ISIS fighters. There are some reports that of various credibility that al-Baghdadi was killed while hiding in the compound of Horace al-Din commander. So there are hints about it. I was just thinking that, more long-term, given the symmetry of their worldview, given the fact that, look, Baghdadi's strategy has not worked. There's no Islamic State and caliphate, and Baghdadi himself is dead. I mean, a hard, cold, realistic assessment of ISIS's strategy proves that Zawahiri was right, that you had to be patient, you had to play the long game, that al-Baghdadi's declaration of a caliphate to situate ISIS within the fifth phase of that seven-stage strategy that Saif al-Adil had developed in 2005 and steal al-Qaeda's thunder. I mean, al-Zawahiri said that was precipitous, it was promiscuous, it was impatient. So that's in essence what I'm basing it on. And the point that Michael Vickers had made, this is a divinely ordained struggle, and it means all sorts of alliances and all sorts of accommodations are certainly on the table in order to achieve the ultimate aim. And potentially, as ISIS is pressed harder perhaps by what I see as an increasingly influential al-Qaeda presence in Idlib through Horace al-Din, the attraction of some kind of modus vivendi, I would argue, grows much stronger, especially because of the current ISIS leader, who is, in essence, as I said, a secularist, a former Ba'athist, a former Iraqi officer who's a survivor and is enormously practical, and I think does not carry with him the deep, profound personal enmity that al-Baghdadi felt towards al-Zawahiri.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is we haven't really seen sharing of logistical routes, but and we haven't seen the strategic accommodation yet that Bruce talks about as a possibility, but low-level fighters have gone back and forth in various areas. So, in Syria, in Yemen, where ISIS is pretty weak, and people switch alliances all the time. In Afghanistan, the reverse has taken place. Some al-Qaeda guys have gone over to ISIS, but it's all been, foot soldiers, essentially, or local commanders.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm John Utley with the American Conservative. Our main writer on defense is William Lind, who's well known in strategy. The most recent book, Martin van Crefeld, is a famous Israeli historian, was Strategy from Sun Tzu to William Lind. Lind's arguments is that we should be on defense. We should have a defensive containment policy, not the offense. As Mr. Vickers said, we must maintain our offensive strategy. Well, we submit that that's been not worked. It's just created more enemies than we kill. 25 countries now hate America in a Yahoo survey. We should be in containment. And this has cost us $6 trillion. We see unending terrorism. Mr. Doran's excellent analysis of Turkey, when he explains that, I think, how can the United States government or army possibly understand all those different interests and juggle them one against the other? That we're unable to do this. All we do is waste money. We subsidize the Congress, puts tens of billions of wasted money into the defense budget because they all say we're fighting terror. We should contain it like we did the Soviet communism, and then it wouldn't cost as much, and it worked with the Soviets. It's not working with the Muslim terrorists.
Micah Vickers, I think.
Sure,
this is
well,
one for you.
I don't know what you mean by containment, but we tried containment of Al-Qaeda before 9/11, didn't turn out too well. So you'd have to give me the details of what you're talking about. But I think your point confuses two things. One, large-scale nation building and efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan are not the same as fighting the global jihadists. There's lots of other strategies to do that. And then second, whenever we've given sanctuary to global jihadist organizations, the threat to the American homeland has gone up. And so, again, I know how you attack it. I know how you attack those sanctuaries. I don't really know how you contain them in a global world. It just makes no sense to me. It's not this. I mean, I'm an old Cold Warrior, and we fought the Soviets. We deterred them by improving our conventional forces. We deterred them with strategic weapons, and then we fought proxy wars, and we did a pretty good job against them in Afghanistan. I think that was a good decision to wage that as part of an aggressive containment.
Can I?
Yeah.
I think I am somewhere between you and Mike on this, in that I wouldn't want to have a doctrine like defense or containment, because there are going to be times when there are threats that are going to arise that we're going to want to just go take action against, I think. And ISIS is a good example. That's one where I think it was good to go destroy it. But I do think that the way we went into Iraq, that is, without our Turkish ally, we had a crisis in U.S.-Turkish relations at that time. And at a moment when we were so much more powerful than everybody else, gave us the feeling that we can do whatever we want unilaterally, and we don't have to think about anybody else. I mean, it is a kind of, it is a fact of U.S. power that the United States, in any arena in the world, I think, can make itself the single most important factor in that arena if it wants to. And so it becomes then just an intellectual choice that we have, or a political choice of who's going to be our friend and who's going to be our and who's going to be our enemy, if we're willing to use that kind of force. And that's, I think, unlike the situation of almost every other country in the world. Every other country has their friends and enemies dictated by the map, and their choices are constrained in that way. We're constrained by our imaginations only. And that leads us, I think, to do a lot of silly things. And to go back to Turkey again, I mean, Turkey is a country that is, we don't go into Hong Kong to save the protesters in Hong Kong, because China is so powerful and can impose such damage on us that it would be silly to do. Turkey is in that middle position, which is true of every other country in the Middle East. The Middle East is full of these middle-range powers. They're strong enough to cause you an enormous amount of difficulty if they want to. A lot of times they're just going to sit passively until you're when we have these moments of moral panic or of muscle flexing, they just sit quietly and they wait until our attention is somewhere else, and then they go do what they want to do. And that's what we then can't create an order that allows us to have a more defensive posture. We have to start with the map first, and then develop the counterterrorism strategy with regard to the map.
Thank you. And I think we have time for 2 more short questions. Yes, sir.
Dario Cristiani, GMF fellow at the German Marshall Fund. I have a question for Michael Doran. You were talking about Turkey and Russia after the accident. How much you think that the approach of Putin towards Erdogan after the coup, the failed coup, that played in the importance of this action in having Russia and Turkey moving closer to each other, and if you think that this is already a strategic alliance or it's still a tactical alliance that could turn strategic at some point? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great question. For reasons of time, I didn't go into the coup. Let me just briefly say that there are 2 issues that have made Turks' heads explode. One is our support for the PKK, and the other is the fact that Gulen is here in the United States. The Turks hold Gulen responsible for the coup, and they don't understand why the United States has not extradited him. It's possible that if we could put Erdogan here on the stage and put truth serum in him and ask him to tell us exactly what he thinks, he may actually hold the Gulen issue as a bigger issue than the PKK. I don't know, but the point is it's huge. Yeah. It's absolutely huge, and Putin has played it very well. The question now to me is, can we actually? Turkey is clearly with the S-400s. What Turkey is doing is it's putting itself in a position to play Moscow off against the U.S. to balance the two. The question is, can we get Turkey completely back ever? And I don't know that we can. I still think that having them sitting on the fence like that is a better position than the alternative, which is to push them totally into the arms of the Russians. He does not want to be there. There's a long history of this in Turkey, by the way, which goes back to Ataturk. Ataturk, in the early days of the Republic, played the West off against the Soviet Union. So this isn't. This is well within the worldview of Turkish nationalists to preserve the independence and integrity of the Turkish state by balancing the great powers. I think that's what he's doing. We have, when I look at Turkey, we have Turkey in World War I, where it was allied against the West, Turkey in World War II, where it was neutral, and Turkey that we knew in the Cold War. We're now kind of somewhere moving back toward the neutral model. World War II is better than World War I. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Okay. One last question. Well, okay, I'm going to ask a quick last question. I'd just like to know, does any of this have any bearing on the rising threat from China? Or are these completely independent matters?
Absolutely.
Just really quickly, why?
No, absolutely. Look, the threat, the number one threat of the United States in the Middle East is the rise of Iranian power. The fear that we should have is that Iran will ally with China or with Russia and China in order to take over the Persian Gulf. That's what they want. Look, if I told you in I don't know, 2006 or 7 that the United States was going to leave Iraq and Iran was going to take over, you'd told me that I was fantasizing. But that is what has happened. The Iranians can see that if the United States was to withdraw further from the Persian Gulf, it can become the dominant power in the Persian Gulf, and it can control all of those oil resources. This would, and that together, they can also imagine the land bridge for which they are trying to build from Baghdad to Beirut. Their goal is to cut off Europe from its oil supplies. This is, I think, similar to the Cold War. In the Cold War, we feared that Russia would cut off Europe from its oil supplies. We wouldn't be able to rebuild Western Europe. and the Russians would detach it and make Western Europe a satellite or kind of neutral in the Cold War. With China's Belt and Road Initiative, should be our fear, that it will align with the Iranians to cut off the Europeans from their oil sources. Turkey is huge in this. There's a critique of Turkey out there that says it's not, look, it's hostile to the West. It won't work with us on that. The basic rule to remember is that wherever Turkey is, Iran is not. And Turkey is preferable to Iran. Whatever our faults of Turkey, Turkey is preferable to Iran. Think of this country, Azerbaijan, and it's part of the world. In Azerbaijan, there are 3 powers. The United States is not one of them. There's Russia, there's Iran, and there's Turkey. We have people in the Senate today who are talking about collapsing the economy of Turkey. If we collapse the economy of Turkey, what do you think is going to happen to Azerbaijan? It's going to become a satellite of Russia and Iran. It's as simple as that. We don't need to overthink this too much. We want Turkey to be independent and powerful, even if we have friction with it.
And I would just add, China is our greatest long-term challenge by far, and they're very happy that we have other periods in history, the dominant power faces a number of challenges, and the rising power really focuses on displacing the dominant power, and that's what the Chinese are doing now. I tend to think we overdo regional powers to some extent. It's a legacy of the post-Cold War area where we didn't really have great power competition. And we do have to have economy of force in the Middle East against terrorists, but we also have to prevent another 9/11 attack, or we will get very bad consequences. But when you look at the world back from 2050, it's going to be the U.S.-China competition that matters most.
Bruce, do you have any final
Well, I
words?
suppose in counterterrorism, China is advertising its policy and initiatives against the Uyghurs as something that can be readily adopted and followed by other countries. So you can then decide what kind of a world you want to live in, one where 1 million people, and I've actually been to Xinjiang, and to Urumqi, and to that area, whether you want a society where 1 million people are oppressed as brutally as they are, or for all of its problems, as we've, I think, very clearly revealed in this panel, or the counterterrorism pursued perhaps a little bit more haphazardly by the United States and the West.
So we leave you with things to think about over coffee and invite you for a coffee break, and we'll reconvene for panel 2 at 10:45. Thank you all.